Advances in technology and the emergence of green economies will further disrupt labor markets in the coming years and turn retraining workers into one of the highest priorities for businesses and governments. Well, that's according to the World Economic Forum's newest Future of Jobs report released today. Saadia Zahidi is managing director of the World Economic Forum and one of the co-authors of that report, and she joins me today. Saadia, welcome to the show. Before we dive deeper into the report, I want to ask you if you could briefly sort of summarize what the biggest takeaway is from this report. This is the first one since the, I guess, quote unquote, end of COVID. I don't know if we can say that. What should we take away from it?
I think it's obviously been a very disruptive period, but there is more disruption to come. That's essentially what we find, with a quarter of jobs likely to go through some kind of a change, about 12% likely to decline, and about 10% that are likely to grow.
All right, so a lot of disruption in this report. I want to talk about one of the first points that I saw in this report is this idea of divergence within labor markets based on skill. Now, we know that there's always been a gap in incomes and in outcomes for workers based on skill level. Higher skilled workers tend to earn better than lower skilled workers. Should we be concerned that that gap is getting bigger and bigger with new technologies and that, in fact, it's becoming a gulf?
I think it's very clear that there is a hollowing out happening of the labor market based on skills levels. In the last few years, it's really been about this concern around industrial robots displacing those that work in factories, for example. Now, to some extent, there's been that displacement, but to some extent, there's also been a lot of growth in terms of the advanced manufacturing workforce. A very similar pattern is now emerging when it comes to artificial intelligence, where those that are at the lower end of the skills around administrative and secretarial work now risk being disrupted by AI, especially generative AI. And at the same time, there's a lot of growth in higher value add roles. So we're seeing a very similar inflection point now. And so there is some of that risk, but the net result is still positive when it comes to technology impacting jobs.
You mentioned this disruption, that is this idea that jobs are going away, jobs are coming in due to factors such as technology, the green economy taking root. Why is it that we see a net positive instead of a net negative when we look at, for example, automation? That's obviously something that's in the headlines. We look at what's happened with generative AI. I imagine a lot of viewers have the feeling that there are going to be fewer jobs because they might be taken over, especially on the lower skill level.
Yeah, so this is where half of the companies that we surveyed actually expect technology to be a net job creator, and about a quarter expect technology to be a net job destroyer. So overall, I think the outlook is positive rather than negative, especially when it comes to overall numbers. And I think in part this is because of the possibilities of the application. So some of the largest gains in jobs are going to come, for example, from the agriculture sector, about 4 million new jobs. Some of the largest gains are in education, about 3 million new jobs. When it comes to the green revolution, about 1 million new jobs. And each one of these roles is going to be in part enabled by these technologies. So I think it's not quite as simple as technology taking away people's jobs. There's a lot of additional augmentation and growth across sectors that technology will also create.
When we talk about sectors like education and agriculture, areas in which we might see more job production in the years ahead, as you just said, what kind of quality jobs are these going to be? Teaching, for example, has not generally been a high-paying job. So we're going to see more people shifting into new jobs produced in that area, but at the same time, they may be taking a step backwards in terms of quality of life, quality of livelihood.
You know, some of the highest growth in teaching is coming from vocational education teachers, as well as university and higher education. These tend to be higher paid roles than, for example, primary and secondary school teachers. But that is not to say that there shouldn't be a societal investment in upgrading, for example, the wages in teaching, in nursing, and some of the other professions that have traditionally been undervalued but are actually critical, especially if we're going to develop the human capital in future generations that prepares them for the future of work.
Your report lists some of the job titles that could be affected. That is, those that could increase and those that we're less likely to see as we move forward. I want to go through a few of those. Those job titles that we might see less of are generally in the secretarial and administrative roles, such as banking tellers, clerks, postal clerks, cashiers, ticket clerks, data entry clerks. Now compare that to job titles we might see more of. They're largely technology related: AI and machine learning specialists, sustainability specialists, that's more green economy, business intelligence analysts, and information security specialists. So as you've been saying, there are opportunities for job growth provided that people can retrain. This seems to be a big point of this report. Are businesses and governments preparing for this massive training burden that they'll need to take on?
I think it's clear that both workers themselves and businesses have evolved. The last time we did this report 3 years ago versus today, it's clear that much more investment is going into reskilling and upskilling by companies. But it's not always the reskilling and upskilling that workers will need to be able to transition into a new role. A company is investing in what they need and the skills they will need for the future. But that doesn't mean that somebody who is being displaced is going to be able to get that from their current employer. And that's where governments need to step in. And that needs to be at a much larger scale than what is currently happening today. And it needs to be more sophisticated than what is happening today. At the moment, most countries are providing some level of an income safety net. Most are providing access to some kind of lifelong learning and some kind of support through career and job centers. But this needs to happen at a completely different scale. And these three things need to be brought together: the income safety net, the career advice, as well as the reskilling and upskilling. The good news is it actually can be done relatively fast, again, using the very technologies that are disrupting jobs.
When we look at women and men, when it comes to disruption that we expect to see, will they likely be equally affected?
It's very clear that thus far they have not been equally affected, and women have lost out more when it comes to the pandemic-related disruptions and the industries that essentially never recovered. It's also clear that when it comes to some of the lower skilled, lower paid work that is likely to be disrupted by artificial intelligence, you name some of those roles, they tend to be larger employers of women than of men. And so even looking at the future disruption, there are likely to be gender differences. And that is where, again, reskilling and upskilling efforts will need to be targeted, and it needs to start much earlier. There needs to be more focus on getting girls and young women into technology much earlier in schooling and in university.
Is it also possible that technology could actually outpace our ability to train for it? That is, that my job is automated, or I don't have the ability to work in the same fashion. I train for something new, but then that becomes irrelevant in the near future.
We've been partnering for the last few years with companies like Coursera, with companies like LinkedIn, and really trying to understand how fast can some of this reskilling actually happen. To your point, do we all need to wait for new 4-year degrees, or is it something that can be adjusted in 3 or 4 months? And I think that's where there really is a massive promise in online learning and credentialing, again, provided that governments actually take that seriously and start providing good certifications around some of that online learning. Employers, because of the very tight labor markets and advanced economies, and because they're facing talent shortages, are actually starting to accept a lot of those online learning and training certifications. And the good news is most of them are done in a few months, including for pretty sophisticated new set of skills.
Are you seeing economies? Can you name economies that are taking the kind of steps forward with training that you've talked about to this point?
So it's very clear that the Nordic economies that have always been ahead of the curve in terms of human capital development have also stayed ahead of the curve throughout the course of the pandemic and now continue to do so. The flex security model, for example, that exists in Denmark and in other parts of the Nordic economy. So that's certainly working well. The forum's also been working with a number of emerging markets as well as developed economies to actually put in place some of these models so that they can be taken elsewhere in the world. We're working with about 15 economies at the moment, from Greece and India and Pakistan to Brazil, that are also starting to put some of this in place for specific sectors in their economies.
And we know, of course, it's not just technology that's disrupting many of these job sectors, but also the growth to make our economies greener. And we're seeing a lot more manufacturing coming on board. When we think about all the wind turbines, heat pumps, electric cars that need to come onto the markets and also be installed and repaired. Are we seeing a kind of period of the end of manufacturing? Because when I grew up in the U.S., it was always manufacturing was something that was on the decline. It was in the rearview mirror, and we were moving towards a service economy. But it seems like now there's a lot more manufacturing coming. Are we seeing a lot more of these jobs that could be produced in the future?
There's a lot more investment by governments in forms of manufacturing and infrastructure development. There's sort of a rise of industrial policy again in a lot of the Western world that we haven't seen in the last few decades. So there is a lot more money, a lot more investment, a lot more finance going into this space. And to your point, very much with the aspiration to get towards a greener economy. So there is that increase. But I also think there's an element where this is becoming much more widespread. It's not just in the manufacturing sector. There's a rise in those that have sustainability-related skills across all businesses, regardless of whether that's manufacturing or services. There's a desire for more people that have environmental protection-related skills. There's very focused increase in demand for those that are working, for example, in solar energy. So there's a combination of very widespread growth where the green economy and green skills are in high demand across almost all sectors.
Saadia, we touched a little bit on AI. Of course, that's such a prominent theme right now and something that many workers are thinking about and already using in their offices, for example. Generative AI is, of course, what we're seeing with ChatGPT and those kind of models. Is it possible that in terms of its disruption that it causes in the labor markets, that it could be overhyped? For example, when it comes to robotics and automation, we still haven't seen the kind of replacement of factory workers that actually was once imagined and that many businesses believed would have already taken place, or that there was more, inertia going towards a level of automation. Is it possible that with AI as well, it's not quite going to reach the level that we're seeing?
Yeah, so we have been testing every couple of years that we launch this report. We sort of try to get an assessment of where the human-machine frontier is. And we try to do that across a set of tasks. And it's very clear that when it comes to tasks that require manual dexterity or physical force in some form or the other, those tasks are no more automatable today than they were 3 years ago or 5 years ago before that. So those things are starting to even out. But when it comes to tasks that require coordination, reasoning, communicating with others, they are slightly more automatable today than they were a few years ago. So it is very clear that as an aggregate, businesses are starting to see how some of these new technologies could be used more. But then when we look at the evidence across specific professions, there's net job growth, even with the disruptive potential of generative AI. So I think you're right that their application in terms of net decline is likely to be limited to very few professions. And in most cases, we're talking about something that will enhance productivity and lead to people being able to do more value-added work.
Do we expect that AI can also help bridge this skills gap that we're seeing between the low-skilled and high-skilled workers?
A lot of online learning and training providers do already use artificial intelligence in some form or the other to be able to support online learning and training. There's also been some very interesting studies in just the few months that ChatGPT has existed. Eric Brynjolfsson in the US has done a study around call centers and what happens when lower skilled workers in call centers are using support from ChatGPT versus higher skilled workers. And essentially what it does is it allows for a faster transferring of skills, better responses from some of those that are working in that profession. Now that's one study, one profession, but I think there's an interesting use case there that helps show that in general, artificial intelligence should be able to help upskill people a little faster so that then they can spend more of their time on critical and analytical thinking.
We talk, of course, about the labor market of the future and how some jobs could be displaced. Many more will come on as well. At the same time, we're seeing right now, especially amongst high-income countries, we're seeing that there's a need for talent, that there's actually a deficit of talent for many companies. And according to your report, that could actually put the brakes on a lot of growth. Is there a bright side to this kind of tight labor market that we're seeing in many of these countries, in that it could be more inclusive in terms of what working looks like, in terms of tapping the labor market for groups that used to be forced out earlier?
So one of the clear messages that comes out from the report is that companies are starting to take diversity, equity, and inclusion very seriously, not only because of the social good that it creates, but also because they are looking for talent. And so they're looking into pools that they maybe wouldn't have looked at as much as they're currently doing. About 70% of them are planning to engage many more women as part of their DEI programs. About 60% are looking at youth, about 50% are looking at people with disabilities, and they're looking to bring much more of that talent in. A second element is that companies are starting to look beyond the very traditional signals of who has a good skill set. So instead of looking at previous employment and instead of looking at their degree, which may have been completed 10 years ago, they're actually testing people for skills, using artificial intelligence in part to look for those skills and for keywords within their CVs once they're in, to help reskill and upskill them rather than expecting to buy talent directly from the market. So I think there are some overall positive results because of the tighter labor markets, because businesses are investing very differently in skills and skills-first approaches, and investing very differently in diversity, equity, and inclusion.
What could that tighter labor market and that attempt to invest more in diversity, equity, inclusion, what could it mean for some of the developments that we saw during the COVID economy, especially hybrid and remote working possibilities? These are applications that offer many more workers the opportunity to come into the labor market, for example. But we've also seen that some businesses have tried to move away from them. They say they want more employees back in the office. What's the balance that we're seeing when it comes to hybrid and remote? Do we know that yet?
I think it's hard to make a prediction for the next 4 years, because if we look back at the last 3 years, so much has changed there. But we have asked companies to tell us more about their particular policies. Most are planning to keep some version of hybrid work in place. And I think that can indeed be very good news for more diverse workforces, as long as the criteria for wages, for promotions, also remain equal, and that there isn't an expectation that only those that are in person will then have access over time to higher wages and promotion opportunities. So I think there's a balance to be struck. While hybrid work can be good from the get-go for minorities, for women, for those that have care responsibilities, on the other hand, we have to make sure then that that doesn't lead to bias in the workplace afterwards.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. That is Saadia Zahidi. She is Managing Director of the World Economic Forum and a co-author of the newly released Future of Jobs report. Saadia, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.